Hello and welcome to NCFS Unbound. We're delighted. I'm Susan McCready, and with my co-hosts Masha Belenky and Rachel Mesch, we're delighted to have Sima Godfrey with us today, who's going to be speaking about her new book, The Crimean War and Cultural Memory, the War France Won and Forgot. A little bit of business first, just to remind everybody how we're going to do things. We're recording this session, and so I'm very happy to introduce our guest today. Sima Godfrey recently retired from the Department of French, Hispanic, and Italian Studies at the University of British Columbia, where she has taught since 1989. Prior to that, she taught in the Department of Romance Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. In 1998, she founded the UBC Institute for European Studies, which she directed until 2007. Under her directorship, the Institute organized over 30 conferences and established an interdisciplinary MA program in European Studies, the first of its kind in Canada. Sima Godfrey lectures regularly in Canada, in France, and in the United States. She's published and edited works on the usual suspects in 19th century French literature: Balzac, Baudelaire, Flaubert, Gautier, Mallarmé, Maupassant, Nerval, and Zola, as she notes. That is the alphabetical listing, as well as some unusual ones in no particular order. Her research interests are wide-ranging, from Baudelaire and 19th century poetics to French fashion and cultural history. Some favorite titles include Mummy, Dearest, Cryptic Codes in Gautier's Pied de Mumie, Rien que ton costume, on te met à la porte, the importance of being fashionable in 19th century France, Lamartine, and My Shoes, and du Grand Prix de Rome au Grand Mépris de Rome. Increasingly, her work is focused on the historical and cultural contextualizations of French literature and art, and it is that focus that brought her to the study of the Crimean War and cultural memory. She now claims that she is on the faculty of the University of Yiddish Columbia. Okay. I can't believe you made me say that. All right. And then I'm going to introduce also, before we move to Sima's presentation, I'm going to introduce Judith as well. Judith Miller is Associate Professor of History, is an Associate Professor in the History Department at Emory University. Her research is on the French Revolution, and she's completing a book manuscript entitled The Political Self of the French Revolution, Mind, Emotion, and Terror, 1760 to 1804. And this book moves between politics, cultural works, and early psychiatry. She co-edited Republics at War, 1776 to 1840, Revolutions, Conflicts, and Geopolitics in Europe and the Atlantic World, with Pierre Cernan and Antonino de Francesco Palgrave, 2013, and Taking Liberties, Problems of a New Order in France, 1794 to 1804, with Howard G. Brown, and that was published with Manchester University Press in 2002. Judith Miller's earlier work was in economic history, including Mastering the Market, the State, and the Grain Trade in Northern France, 1700 to 1860, which was a book with Cambridge from 1998. She also teaches courses on fake news, early capitalism, and probably, she claims, the only university-level course in North America on the history of skiing and snow sports. And I might have questions about that later. So, but without further ado, let me turn it over to Sima Godfrey.
First of all, I'd like to thank Susan and Rachel and Masha for this opportunity. And more largely, I'd like to thank the members of the 19th Century French Studies Association, who over the years have given me the opportunity to test drive ideas about the Crimean War in formal sessions as well as in informal bars. It was at these meetings of the association that I invariably got the best questions, the best answers, the best you should look at, and I'm really grateful. I'm also grateful for your patience to those who I've badgered about this for so many years. About this war on a Crimean peninsula far from the excesses of Second Empire Paris. I also want to thank Judith, whom I haven't seen for many years. Our paths originally crossed when she was at Duke University and I was at Chapel Hill. And so it's lovely to reconnect all these years later to talk about France again. So living at a time right now of two major wars, one of the questions one can't help asking, and particularly with thinking about the Crimean War, is how does a war fall off the radar? How does a war get forgotten? Just to prime you here, the Crimean War from 1854 to 1856, which pitted an alliance of countries in support of the Ottoman Empire against Russia, was, in the words of Eric Hobsbawm, the nearest thing to a general European war between 1815 and 1914. It's widely considered the first modern war, with its tactical use of railways, telegraphs, steam-propelled battleships, rapid-fire long-range rifles, its 200-pound explosive shells, and its notorious trenches, tactical precursors of the Great War. It's also the first media war, the first war to have known the presence and impact of a war correspondent on the battlefield, and it was the first war to be documented in photographs. Susan, could you put up the next slide? Terrific. The war looms large in the national mythologies of Britain and Russia, whether in Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade or Tolstoy's Sebastopol sketches. It was memorialized throughout the British Empire. That bottom picture on your right is of a panorama, an enormous panorama in Sebastopol that still exists, where people can go and relive the battle for Sebastopol. Of course, under the present circumstances, I have no idea whether it's still operating, but until recently, it was. So looking at the literature, the art, the theater, material objects, and medical reports, my book considers how the Crimean War was and was not represented in French cultural history in the second half of the 19th century. Or more exactly, it considers how it was and was not forgotten. How, why does a war disappear from memory? How, why did this war disappear from French collective memory? That is the big question the book addresses, and the first one I always get asked. And I'll get to the second question in a minute. The invisibility of the Crimean War in French collective memory is not a case of motivated forgetting or the kind of repression of trauma that is often associated with wartime. The Crimean War, I argue, was not suppressed from French national and cultural memory. It was forgotten. Cultural memory participates in shaping national identity by cultivating specific events of the past that are like fixed points on the horizon. For the French, the Crimean War is clearly not one of those fixed points. On the contrary, it lies outside the horizon of the relevant. It is forgotten, but it's not lost. For as we know, to quote Aleda Assmann, quote, what is lost, and she's talking about memory, collective memory and cultural memory, what is lost may be discovered by accident at a later time in attics and other obscure depots, or as I have discovered, even on eBay. I'll get back to that. Actually, I don't have to get back to that. That dessert dish you will see comes from eBay. So in writing this book, that's pretty much what I set out to do, recovering hidden clues and forgotten traces of the Crimean War that were left on the French cultural landscape. And in the course of that scavenger hunt, I was able to reconstruct a picture of France divided by elite, popular, and state-sanctioned cultures, and the exemplary case of a war that fell through the cracks of all of them. There. I'm just going to move on to slide 3. Susan, can you move on to slide 3? As I mentioned, this war figures widely in both Russian and British national mythology and was commemorated throughout the British Empire, everywhere. So as an example here, you had Russian cannons that were seized at Sebastopol by the British are everywhere throughout the empire, even in front of the state houses in Guyana and so on. And even one which I'd love to show in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. And there you've got the plaque on it. This is in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. Victorieuse lors de la campagne de Crimée, la Grande-Bretagne a voulu remercier les villes de son empire qui avaient participé à l'effort de guerre. Ainsi, Trois-Rivières a reçu un canon enlevé à l'armée du Tsar. In Vancouver, British Columbia, where I live, dogs play in Balaclava Park. My dog's vet is on Alma Street, both named for battles in the early battles in the Crimean War. There is nothing equivalent, no equivalent national monuments or monuments throughout France of this nature. In fact, no one, including the French themselves, and excluding those of you who've had to sit through my talks, no one seems to remember that the French were there too, leading the Allied campaign against Russia. And this despite the fact that they lost 95,000 men, and that moreover, it was the only major war, 19th century war, that the French won. And again, Susan, can I have the next slide? And this despite the fact that boulevards and squares across France are named Malakoff and especially Sebastopol. I had fun looking these up. So this just gives you an idea of how that name has entered certainly the traffic patterns of France, but not the memory. So when in March 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, French readers were surprised to learn that 150 years earlier, they had fought a war on that same ground. But that knowledge registered largely as a fun fact, soon to be forgotten. It would seem that the Crimean War has no place in the canon of culturally retained historical events that define modern French identity. How do we explain this? And this is where I'll get to some of those objects that I was mentioning. Susan, can you go on to the next slide? Okay, I was mentioning these objects. The Crimean War was available visibly at every level, in every class, and in every possible genre during this time. Here I'm just giving you two contrasting images. One, this enormous epic painting by Adolphe Yvon, 6 meters by 9 meters, called La Prise de la Tour Malakoff. You'll notice the French Zouave at the top holding the flag. To his right, there's General Macmon. And this was one of many, many epic paintings that were created to represent the war, shown at different salons and so on. To the right, you have something much more banal and popular, a dessert plate that represents the same moment, Bombardement de la Tour Malakoff. I have a collection of these dishes from different manufacturers in France. This was quite a common thing to do to represent battle scenes on dishes. And as I say, there were different manufacturers. And this is one of those items that I found very proudly on eBay. Susan, can you go to the next slide? Okay, and here again, more of the material culture we were talking about. On the left here, you have this handkerchief, établissement orthopédique fondé à l'occasion de la prise de Sébastopol. There's a whole series of handkerchiefs that were created representing different scenes, including scenes of battle. I simply picked one because I thought it was very funny that you would have one about an orthopedic hospital created. Below that, you have the Guerre d'Orient Jeux de l'Auto. There were many board games that were created around this war, as well as Images d'Épinal and so on, we know. You'll see I put down that this one is courtesy of Alain Rabussier, who is somebody I discovered who has an extraordinary collection of board games from the 18th century up to present. And he was kind enough to let me look at some of his Crimean War games. And so this is why you have the Jeux de l'Auto. But my favorite material object, which you have on the top right, is this chocolat Malakoff, and you see underneath the name 1855. And there's the story. To celebrate the French victory at Malakoff, Napoleon III asked the prize chocolatier Jean-Louis Pupier to create a sweet to commemorate the event. Pupier came up with a rectangular bar wrapped in gold metallic paper with the date 1855 prominently displayed below the name Malakoff, and it is still in production, although under new ownership. And below, I simply put in a box of a more recent chocolates from them, largely because it says chocolat les inoubliables. And I am talking, of course, about something that was oubliable. But one of the images that best exemplifies the disappearance of this war from cultural memory is the one that you find on the cover of the book, the picture of the Zouave on the column of the Pont de l'Alma. Susan, could you pull that one? There we go. And the picture in the bottom middle is what's on the cover of my book. By the way, the historic event that is now most associated with the Pont de l'Alma is, of course, the death of Princess Diana, who has her own place at one end of the bridge. However, the bridge, the Pont de l'Alma, was built between 1854 and 1856 by Napoleon III to commemorate the first battle of the Crimean War, one in which the French distinguished themselves, and especially the Zouave soldiers distinguished themselves. And that bridge was decorated with statues of soldiers from different regiments on its 4 pillars. Now, of all the regiments, it was the Algerian-born Zouaves, whom you see here in the picture, in their exotic uniforms, who captured the imagination. Remembered and celebrated for his legendary courage in Crimea, the Zouave on the bridge is now best known, however, less for his bravery than for his serving as a measure of the water level of the Seine. During the great floods of 1918, the water reached his shoulder. Since then, Parisians measure rising water levels against his ankles, knees, and thighs. Next slide. Downgraded for service as he may be, he has nevertheless fared better than his colleagues who were on the 3 remaining pillars of the bridge, the chasseur de pied, le grenadier, and l'artilleur, who were removed from the Pont de l'Alma and scattered around France when the bridge was widened in 1970. Today, the chasseur, whom you see on the bridge on the postcard on the right, the chasseur now occupies a spot on the side of the A4 autoroute coming into Paris, lost on the highway, if not in the archives. I mentioned by scavenging through eBay some of these postcards. That's exactly where I found them. Again, it was a great thrill. So that gives you generally the questions and the issues that the book is looking at in the broadest sense. And I said I was going to get to the second question that I am invariably asked. And that is that given that my work has focused on French poetry, art history, fashion, and footwear, how did I end up writing about a military campaign? And it's actually quite simple. As a 19e-iste, I have spent a lot of time curled up in the decade of the 1850s, the decade of Baudelaire, Flaubert, Gautier, Sand, the decade of Courbet, Manet, the opening decade of Napoleon III's Second Empire, the decade of Haussmannization, the decade of Charles Worth, and much more. So I was taken aback when one day the topic of the Crimean War turned up in a totally unexpected French context. And I realized that I knew virtually nothing about the war short of the charge of the Light Brigade, Florence Nightingale, and Tolstoy's Sebastopol sketches. I didn't know, for instance, that the French, with triple the number of the troops of the British had sent over, had played a central role in the war and in its victory. I didn't know that the French had lost as many men as the British had sent over in total. I didn't know that it was the only major war the French had won in the 19th century. How could I, who spent my time reading French works written and published in the 1850s, have missed a 3-year war the French had fought and won smack dab in the middle of my decade? So after a certain amount of self-shaming, I returned to the question less rhetorically. How indeed did I miss a war? The truth was that this war did not feature in any of the works I was reading. In the decades following the war, I could not think of a single work of French literature that referenced it. In other words, it was not that I had overlooked the Crimean War in my reading, it wasn't there in the works. Not long after the end of the war, Jules Michelet, who was concerned about the health of the animals in the Jardin des Plantes, he declared, I'm quoting, "Saving the llama is 10 times more important than the conquest of Crimea," unquote. In May 1857, Alfred de Vigny, the poet and former army officer, he denounced French indifference to a war that had ended just 1 year earlier. And I quote, "People don't think about it anymore. 100,000 men lost. For France, it's like a haircut." But he didn't write about the war either. It was this aha moment that sent me in search of a war, and this particular war, that was and wasn't represented in French cultural and collective memory. And it's then that I took on this challenge of writing what I called my livre sur rien. So the book is divided into 5 chapters. The first chapter, which is the introduction, which sets up some of the questions I've just summarized, the first chapter is called La guerre de Crimée n'aura pas lieu. And those of you in French literature will recognize the echoes of Jean Giraudoux' La guerre de Troyes n'aura pas lieu and Jean Baudrillard's La guerre d'Irak n'aura pas lieu. Chapter 2, À la recherche de la guerre gagnée, is about Crimea, the invisible war. And this is the chapter that looks at writing, at canonical literature, where the war, for the most part, isn't, at popular literature, where it is, and also looks at some curious items like the 1857 Concours de Poésie of the Académie Française, which took as its topic for the competition that year La Guerre d'Orient, which was the other name of the Crimean War. Now, every year the Académie had one of these big poetry competitions. They would select the topic. And the normal submission rate was about 45 to 50 poems that were submitted. There were rules for it. It couldn't be more than 300 lines of verse and various other rules. In any case, when they declared this as the topic in 1857, they received 150 entries, triple the number that they would have any other year. Chapter 3 is called Spectacles of War. And in this chapter, I look at the enormous public spectacles that Napoleon III staged in the streets of Paris, which were carefully choreographed events that translated a distant war into kind of wartime show business. And I talk about 3 particular moments of truly grand spectacle. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people in the city, parades, banners, and so on. And in that chapter, I also look at theater, the representation of the war in theater, both in the metropole and even on the battlefield, where a theater was built by the Zouave troops, where they performed nightly and would periodically jump off stage if there was firing taking place around. They'd pick up their muskets or their rifles, shoot around, and then if they could, come back and finish the play. Chapter 4 is Crimea, the Visible War, as opposed to the invisible one in literature. And this chapter deals with official art, something like the Adolphe Yvon painting I showed you, the Universal Exhibition of 1855, the Salon of 1857, which had 4 rooms devoted exclusively to paintings of the Crimean War, and so on. It also looks at popular art, illustrated newspapers, lithos, caricatures, and especially the new medium of photography. And this chapter considers the paradoxes of a war that permeated all aspects of visual culture in France, only to disappear from view. And finally, chapter 5 is entitled À la recherche de la guerre oubliée, Crimea, the Forgotten War. And in this chapter, I offer 5 hypotheses on why this war was forgotten. And they're not exclusive. I'm sure there are more that can be considered. But these are the 5 hypotheses I present. The first one is historical confusion. How do you remember a war you can't explain? And we can talk about that if you want in the question period. The second hypothesis is Napoleon III's war, all power, no glory. Hypothesis 3, mediations of memory. And this looks, among other things, at the role of journalism, comparing journalism in France as opposed to Britain. Hypothesis 4, which is one that I added to some degree after the fact, which is called the invisible enemy, lessons from an epidemic. And finally, hypothesis 5 is on collective forgetting. And before we end, I can just tell you a little bit about that hypothesis 4, because it's sort of timely. The fourth hypothesis, that's the one on the invisible enemy, it was inspired by the pandemic we were living through as I was trying to finish writing this book, The Invisible Enemy, Lessons from an Epidemic. And it has to do with the fact that 75,000 of the 95,000 Frenchmen who died in Crimea died of illness or epidemic, not battle, primarily cholera and typhus. And the image of these fallen warriors writhing in pain and vomit in makeshift hospitals, as opposed to on horseback with bayonets, did not correspond to any familiar tropes of heroism or narratives of war. Dr. J.C. Chenu, who wrote the report on medical services during the war, he was blunt. Here I'm quoting, "It is not the general, but the doctor who saves armies," unquote. So Crimea was a new kind of war, a war waged primarily in trenches, not in the battlefield, and it demanded a new kind of idiom to commemorate it. It was in many ways a dry run for World War I. And if this particular association to me was heightened by COVID, it was large part because of the military vocabulary that was being used at that time to describe the COVID epidemic. Invisible enemies, people on the front line, people who were brave warriors, and many, many more. And so this relationship between epidemic and war has a long history. And in fact, it goes back to the very opening of the Iliad by Homer, I discovered. So that was sort of one of the interesting hypotheses that I had not anticipated, but also made this book feel particularly timely to me. So that's basically it. And I welcome Judith's questions and comments, and especially comments from any of you.
So hello, can you all hear me okay? Hi there. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you so much to the organizers of this webinar. Here we are at the end of the semester, and we've got 40 people here. We're all at a stage of collapse, so it's wonderful to see you all. And I will say, just more quietly, but 2 of my undergraduates decided to come to this session, so I think we can really applaud that. 2 of my favorite undergraduates. So thank you all for being here. This book, we're talking about this book at a moment that geopolitically feels extremely poignant or even extremely difficult. If you know something about the origins of the Crimean War, you know that it actually, in some ways, began in Jerusalem with a battle between Orthodox clergy and French clergy over who would have the keys to a church. And the French came out on the losing side of that discussion. And then this blossomed into a war in what is now Ukraine, the Crimea. And so here we are in a moment when bombs literally are dropping in both of those places that were deeply connected in this war in the middle of the 19th century. And so I just want to note this. Now, Sima and I had talked about how we wanted to proceed, and she's given you the overview of the book. I have a few questions questions that I want to pose, but I think one of the great strengths, the great interest of this book is the way in which she is really contributing to an interdisciplinary conversation. For historians, art historians, people who work on material culture, people who work in literature. And I want to make absolutely certain that we get time for other people to come in and chat and discuss. So if you want to pose questions in the chat, if you want to in other ways signal that you want to speak up, please do. So first, I'm coming at this as an historian, and I will tell you that when Sima, I came to a webinar, was it maybe a year ago, a year and a half ago, where I came in thinking, Crimean War, right. I'm a historian. I should know more about that. I love Sima's work. Let's hear what she has to say. And instead, I felt like she had dropped a bombshell into the middle of things, and that we have a call to action here. Now, as a French historian, and here really a historian, one of the things that struck me, or that I think strikes a number of us working in the field, is that when we're putting together graduate courses or a graduate reading list or a 19th century French or even European history course, we have great work to draw on from the first part of the 19th century. We have Brian Vick's Congress of Vienna. We have the work now that's coming out from Christine Hayes, Jennifer Hoyer on sort of the Napoleonic military history. If you want to broaden the scope and think about the French colonial empire, well, we've got Laurel Semley, Jennifer Sessions, so many really great works that we can draw on. And then you get to the end of the 19th century, Third Republic. Recently, the book by Sarah Black on drugging France, work by Carolyn Eichner, work by Sarah Horowitz, so many scandals in the Third Republic. And then the question invariably becomes, what are you going to assign on the Second Empire? What are you going to do with the 1850s? And as I listened to Sima give a talk a year and a half ago, and then read this book, I thought, yes, here is an answer to that. And it really kind of shakes us up, saying maybe we need to go back and start thinking again about the middle of the 19th century, which Sima said she spent her career looking at it. And wondering, this might be a question for later, but for those of you who are in literature and art history, do you have that same sense of 1850s, Second Empire, nothing you can do, pass on, it's just a prequel to the Third Republic, or it's the thing you toss into a coda or epilogue when you're working on the early 19th century, but 1850s, it's a dead zone for historians. And yet, here we have Sima telling us, no, it absolutely is not a dead zone. So I'd like to just sort of start here and say, Sima, I know you touched briefly on the conclusions in your book, but one of the things that struck me in those conclusions, and you laid it out so well, is the ways in which your episode helps us to reflect on the myriad ways in which this Crimean War does not fit into any good narrative that we have of the 19th century. It absolutely resists being placed into any of our narratives.
Thanks, Judith. Yes, I mean, one of the things you realize, and particularly if you're looking at sort of military thematics, you have the Napoleonic Wars in the first part. You can go see the film, by the way. You have the Franco-Prussian War that is going to eclipse everything else and which is truly traumatic. And then you have this space in between that nobody seems to know about. And I think that for people who think about the Second Empire, and here I speak largely for people in art history or literature, generally you're going to Paris. You're certainly not going abroad. You're going to Paris. You're looking at the excesses of the Second Empire, the follies of Napoleon III and Eugenie. You're looking at Haussmannization. You're looking at social transformations in Paris primarily. And you're looking at some of these social developments and artistic developments. I mean, it is a very, very rich period. Now, as I said, I couldn't find the war during these years in the literature, but I did find references to it in correspondence by writers. The fact is that everybody knew about this. The war was on the front pages of every newspaper during this time. Anybody who was literate knew that there was a war going on in Crimea. They didn't exactly know why it was happening. As you say, in France, it started with a debate over keys to the Church of the Nativity. And by the way, the Ottomans adjudicated in favor of the French. It was the French who ultimately got the key, and that's why the Russians invaded. But in any case, so this is, people knew there was a war. In fact, in the case of Baudelaire, it was everywhere. In the case of Baudelaire, during this period, he published his translations of Poe stories in the journal called Le Pays. 50 translations appeared in serial form. Always on the bottom half of the third page of the newspaper, you had yet another story by Poe translated by Baudelaire. The front page of that same issue always had the report from Crimea. So in other words, he had to go through Crimea to get to his own story. And there are many other instances of that. So there was no ignorance about it. The information may have been limited, but everybody knew there was a war taking place there. Outside the metropole, many communes and villages were losing young men over there, and aware of that. And the grief and the mourning and the memorials tended to be very, very local as opposed to national. But yeah, it's this gaping hole there, and which is why I said, I decided I'm writing a livre sur rien. It's something that's not there.
Absolutely. Well, and I was wondering if you could say more. Yeah, in fact, we've got a comment from Nikki Georgopoulos, and of course, Baudelaire's favorite guy was a visual war correspondent.
Yes.
And I think brings me to another question.
Sure.
You've talked about, you mentioned the differences between the French press and the British press.
Mm-hmm.
That's such an important chapter of the book. Could you say more? Because certainly one of the things your book shows is the war was everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How did we forget it? But it was everywhere in the press. So you could say more about what was going on in Britain and France.
Sure. Well, in Britain, I mean, this is a major difference. Britain had an uncensored press. That's a major difference. It was Britain who had the war correspondent on the battlefield, and his reports were uncensored. So the British learned very quickly about the dismal conditions of the daily life of the soldiers who had been sent over with summer uniforms and had to live through the worst blizzard of the century without food, without proper clothing. People starved to death. They froze to death. It was absolutely appalling. And of course, we know about the very poor medical conditions, medical treatments that had been set up, which were really paltry, and which is what sent Florence Nightingale over there. And in fact, the public brought down the government based on these reports they were getting in the London Times. French press was censored, heavily censored. So the information on the war came largely through military dispatches, which themselves would have been censored. And there's that statement by Napoleon III, la liberté de la presse jamais. And so the French were getting a very different kind of coverage. The other thing was that in the British press, they actually had letters from soldiers at the front. You had op-eds from citizens writing in. So it was very personalized, whereas in France, you were getting something that was filtered and generalized and underestimated or minimized the challenges, some of the terrible challenges that the army had to deal with. Having said that, there were many more scandals on the British side than there were on the French side. The British mishandled this in appalling ways, and there's good reason why people were scandalized. The French had a much more professional army. They knew how to deliver medical services. They knew how to provide food, all of these things. They were victims of epidemic, which was terrible and tragic, but these were not human-made scandals, as were the scandals on the British side.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think one of the most interesting chapters here, and it's the one that I would really, think about, everyone think about assigning this in your undergrad classes, is the chapter on the material culture, sort of the everyday, the plates, the chocolates, the scarves. And I think that Sima, you deserve a lot of praise, as does the University of Toronto Press, for the numbers of photographs, images that you are able to reproduce, and how many of them are in color. I could flip through the pages here of this section and just kind of say, and here we have, this great photo, that great photo, the visible war. And then, the plates, the wonderful, kind of posters. I don't want to, it's hard to show that on my screen, but just so many really vivid images. And I know you have some tales. You told me a few tales about what led you to some of these. Could you fill that out almost for the grad students who are here, who maybe don't understand how serendipitous but wonderful in terms of sort of the human relationships that can occur when you're doing research?
Well, I mean, this is where, as I said, sleuthing and playing with eBay and all these other things. And we needed that. I needed that kind of fun during COVID. I've got to tell you, these were the few things that made me smile. So at one point, for instance, I found on a blog a picture of a tombstone in a small village in the Var, where a tombstone that had the names of 13 young men from that village who had died in Crimea. As I say, there are no national monuments in France, but you do find these local ones. The picture in the blog was not terribly good. The resolution wasn't very good. And I wrote to the persons who had the blog and I said, do you have a better picture of it? I'd like to use it in a book. And he said, oh no, but the cemetery is only 20 kilometers from where I live. I'll drive and take a picture for you. And I was dealing with this sort of thing all the time. The picture you just saw of the chasseur on the autoroute there, the same thing. I had a not very good photograph of it. And I asked a friend in Paris, do you think you can get me a picture of that? And it would be nice if you could get a car in the photograph to see that. And so it was just so wonderful to get the picture of the Chocolat Malakoff. And they have a website, a professional website, but I needed to get permission to use it. And I was having trouble getting it. And finally, it was the head of the Malakoff company that wrote to me and gave me permission to use the chocolate. And like an Rabustier who collects board games. So I sort of felt like I had created this community that gave me enormous pleasure. And perhaps that pleasure, and maybe I'm overly enthusiastic because I was writing this during a time of a pandemic when I was sort of stuck in home and dependent entirely on Gallica and on eBay and on email, and those moments of sociability across oceans for something that was so specific and unpredictable was terrific. Getting those little postcards. And that's when I started collecting those battle plates. I showed Judith some of them that I have at home because I ended up collecting them from different sets, different manufacturers. And they're wonderful.
I have to say, it's a terrific collection. And it's too bad that you couldn't bring that with you when you traveled from Vancouver to Toronto yesterday. And she was showing me them one by one. Some of them are really quite spectacular. Now, I noticed that we've got some questions here or some comments in the chat. So Corey Cropper has a question. Does the war show up as a return of the repressed in later literary works in the model of Le Colonel Chabert, for example? I'll say Balzac is my guide. That's a very interesting question. And then we've got from Elizabeth Emory, it's interesting to think about different periods and different movements and their literary representations of history. And I wonder whether naturalists mention it more than those living it. I know Goncourt and Zola have novels where the war comes up to criticize the Second Empire, but I'd be curious to see how that plays out. And so we have two questions about kind of how this plays out. And yes, and so she says she also saw Corey's question. So Return of the Repressed, how does this play out? And indeed, your book does have some discussion.
I mean, you do find it in very minor places. As far as the Return of the Press, it's not. What you do find, and this is interesting, there's one novel by an author, Luc Decaune, who was actually on the Académie Goncourt. He at one point was the president of it, and he was a known pacifist who was best known for a novel that was somewhat scandalous called Les Sous-Offs. and it had to do with pacifists in the army. He wrote a novel, the name of which now is escaping me, but it was called La Colonne, and it has to do with the Vendôme colonne. And it takes place during the time of the Commune, and you have the radicals wanting to topple the Vendôme colonne. And you have some veterans of the Crimean War living at the Invalides who were very patriotic, and they gather together. They decide they must save this column against the Republicans and anarchists and so on. And in the course of that, they tell people around them about their experiences during the Crimean War. And they go into that. And that's probably the most detailed description you get of it. They talk about the weather, they talk about the trenches, they talk about the suffering they went through in the Crimean War to defend the country. And of course, some of these Republicans say, well, why did you do it? And they talk about how they had to defend the Catholic Church in the Holy Land. And these Republicans say, why? Why do we bother? And so there's a debate, Descaves, sorry. Descaves, thank you, not de Gaulle, that's somebody alive. Descaves, yes. And he is a naturalist, you're absolutely right. And these descriptions of the war are in great naturalist detail. So that's where you find it. You'll find it also, not exactly about the repressed, in a curious novel by Jules Verne that has to do with 3 French astronomists and 3 Russian astronomists who go to the Kalahari Desert to measure the arc of the meridian. And they're working together, and it's a scientific thing. At one point, they stop at some missionary stand, and there is an old European newspaper from 6 months ago in which they discover that Russia and France are at war. And they have to figure out how they're going to deal with that. All of a sudden, they're enemies. And that's quite interesting. And in the end, for Jules Verne, it's about how the bonds of science trump and should trump the bonds of nationalism, although there is a great deal of tension that comes into the novel at that point. Having said that, the Crimean War occupies 5 pages of a 250-page novel, so it's not central. It's a pretext for a problem that they develop. As far as the other naturalists, and talking about, for instance, Zola, yes, Zola wrote a 20-volume series about the Second Empire. Now, Zola is a young man in his Nouveau Conte de Ninon, where he talks about his childhood. In fact, he describes in his hometown watching the soldiers parade through his town going on their way to Crimea. They picked up the boat in Marseille. And he talks about all the young people chasing these soldiers in their wonderful uniforms and how exciting it was. Then he talks about a few years later, watching these same soldiers come back, mutilated, invalid, just limping away on crutches and so on. And they realized that that march they had celebrated a few years before was in fact a death march. So this is somebody who experienced it firsthand. So this was something quite personal. And yet, you go through the 20 volumes of Rougon-Macquart, you find 4 sentences that refer to the Crimean War. One of them, which you find in La Curée, talks about the fact that there was a distant war that, Paris couldn't care about. They were too busy with real estate and chasing women, something like that. So yes, there's another case. Now, again, one can argue Zola, of course, despised Napoleon III, who gets his just desserts in the final volume, La Débâcle, and so on. So you could say there would be an ideological reason for him not to praise this victory. However, there were 95,000 Frenchmen on this, what he called this death march, who died there. And that is something that does not appear anywhere in his writing or in anyone else's. And as I said, Alfred de Vigny was appalled that a year later, 100,000 Frenchmen died and nobody cared. But then, as I said, he didn't go on to write about it either. So you're dealing with these sort of, these gaps, these gaping holes in the history.
And I think one of the things that struck me as I was reading your book is simply the omnipresence of the war, it appears, you say, in a few paragraphs in a several hundred-page book, or a line here, but you have so much evidence in your book of, yes, it's just a phrase here or a line there or a few, stanzas of poetry, that I think this book will have a lot of people racing back to their canonical authors, or even less canonical ones, saying, and expressing, like, oh my gosh, the Crimean War is here. We never saw it because it had been erased from our memory. And back to this issue of the larger narratives that this war just cannot fit within. As someone who works more on political history, the idea that it fell from view because you cannot put it into the Third Republic narrative of the secular state, I think, is one of the things I really want to, sort of highlight here, that this war has religious origins, and that has some religious statues erected, Notre Dame, grieving the war. That doesn't fit. But one last question about a narrative that's there on and off through the book, but I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more. The history of masculinity has been so important for the history of 19th century. And you would think that a war that the French had won, in which their soldiers had been hyper-professional, they'd been well organized, you would think that this would be a war that could be celebrated. And yet, as you point out, 310,000 soldiers go off to war, 95,000 of them are killed, 75,000 of them, it's disease, cholera and scurvy. So I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about where this might fit in the history of masculinity for France.
Boy, that's a really interesting question, one that I haven't really thought about, and I do want to go back to. There aren't many accounts of, where you would find information there. There aren't many accounts that talk about soldiers' performance and that kind of bravery or heroism or, patriotic masculine virility. But when you read the memoirs of the generals, the officers, and so on, and that's actually what there is. If you're looking for anything written about the Crimean War, it's military history, memoirs by generals and soldiers, which are quite wonderful and where we learn a lot. To give you an idea, I mentioned, let me just see what I was going to say, the fact that nobody understood what this war was about. Among the various things people didn't understand was what the hell were the French doing fighting alongside the British? Now, first of all, the British didn't care about religious sites. For them, it was all geopolitical, let's protect the route to the east. Okay. Most French people couldn't get their head around the fact that the British are our allies. They've always been our enemy. What about Waterloo? What's going on here? They couldn't understand it. And then you have these memoirists, these officers talking about how during moments of truce, the French officers, when they were collecting the dead and the injured, the French officers would wander over to the Russian officers, many of whom spoke French. They would smoke a cigarette together, they would talk, and they would confess that if it was up to them, they'd be fighting the English. They should be on the same side. And there's even a very touching scene in the memoirs of a particular officer where he talks about a French officer who has been injured in battle, lying on the battlefield, and he falls next to a Russian officer who has also been shot, lying on the battlefield. As they're lying there injured, waiting to be collected, they start talking to each other, and on the field of battle, they exchange their calling cards, and they basically say, see you after the war in Paris. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So there are stories like that you find in the memoirs. And I'm sorry, I wanted to include more of that because that's the personal dimension of it that is just so riveting. So I don't know how that fits into discussions of masculinity, but there is this whole discourse that you find by the military themselves. You've got the memoirs by the doctors, which are very interesting. and then by the military people themselves that talk about this. But I'll have to give more thought to the masculinity there. That's a really good point.
And I noticed that we're at 3:00 here. I just have one last question. It may make some of the people in literature kind of roll their eyes. And again, I'm a historian. I'm coming at this from outside your field. But I was thinking Tennyson, that charge of the Light Brigade. I believe that we would say that is part of Romanticism, maybe the last gasp of British Romanticism. But as I was reading your book and looking at the list of authors, I did find myself wondering, is there any room for heroism in realism or in naturalism? And is this war simply so far out of sync with what literature or art could do at the time that there was also an impediment, an obstacle to this possibly heroic moment being remembered as such?
Well,
So does genre matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of Tennyson, I talked about the importance of journalism. An hour after Tennyson read the report in the London Times about that disastrous charge, in which the journalist had said a terrible blunder happened. And Tennyson lifted that line into his poem. And of course, the poem is about a terrible blunder, about a completely misguided, incompetent officer who sent the soldiers directly into the line of fire. But it turned into a poem about self-sacrifice, about honor, and the people who talk about that as an example of true heroism. So it's become a kind of romantic narrative. There's nothing equivalent in French. In Tolstoy's Sebastopol sketches, and again, Sebastopol was a one-year siege where the Russians suffered terribly and so on. And he represents all the suffering, but he talks about the bravery, the courage, the nobility of the Russian people who were the hero. So you've taken this scene of tragedy and turned it into one of patriotic pride. You don't have that on the French side. You don't have any the patriotism. Wait, you get that in the popular poetry. Oh yeah, there's a lot of that. Oh, and again, to make this even more funny, there are all these absurdities about it. So in the Crimean War, you have France and England alongside the Ottomans fighting for the Holy Land against the Orthodox. So, I mean, Karl Marx had a huge giggle because they called it the New Crusade. The French called it a New Crusade. And he was saying, here you've got Catholics and Muslims fighting for the Holy Land over the Orthodox. And he said, what a difference 13 centuries make. I mean, it was, or not 13 centuries. I mean, it's very funny. So there are all these strange things happening all around that are just, they set the imagination roaming.
Indeed, I continue to find that war incomprehensible, but now I think because of your work, I think we can say it's actually more memorable, or it should be more memorable than it was. I noticed a couple comments in the chat that are simply, praising your work. You're brilliant as ever, says Margaret Waller. And then from Barry Lane, I reread Tolstoy's sketches this year because I was astonished by the bravery of the soldiers in the present conflict. And I think this also goes to this question of masculinity, their understated attitudes in the face of terrible destruction and danger. Tolstoy well captured the bravery of the common Russian soldier and their patriotic attachment to the Russian Empire. As well, the mentality of Russian officers, which, although brave, seemed in general very self-centered and detached from the reality of the campaign. And yes, I agree. The parallel,
I just want to say
very strong.
The connection with today is actually very, very relevant because of that siege, Sebastopol was known as the hero city. It was granted special status because of the siege. During World War II, when the Nazis laid siege to Sebastopol, again, it was known, again, the hero city, it was called the Second Great Siege. And Sebastopol was, again, the hero city. It has that label. When in 2014, Putin defended the invasion of Crimea, he talked about Sebastopol, the hero city, how central it is to us. And he talked about he went back to the Crimean War, to Malakoff, and this was the symbol of Russian prowess and patriotism and defense and so on. So there is a myth of Sebastopol that's sort of central to a certain kind of Russian military and national identity that is very, very strong. So that's when I said that the Crimean War has an important spot in Russian national mythology as in British, but it ain't there in France. As I say, most French people don't know. I mean, at one point I was pestering people like Judith, and I would ask them, what do you know about the Crimean War? And I couldn't find French historians to tell me anything about the Crimean War. And so, I thank you to all the people I pestered for your patience.
Well, and thank you for writing this absolutely wonderful book. I hope that, again, in the chat, you'll find the information on buying it at a 25% discount using the code Godfrey25 from the University of Toronto Press. It is beautifully reproduced. The prose is elegant and compelling. The images are very vivid. I think you'll have quite a treat over the winter break.
If I can just put in one small plug for U of T Press, because I did approach several presses when I was doing it. Most of them balked at the number of images when they said, how many images do you have? Oh, we're going to have to cut that out. When I told Toronto I have about 70 images, it was, yeah. And I thought, that's it. That's it.
Well, thank you for writing this wonderful book.
Thank you, Judith, for reading it so carefully.
Thank you both for being here today for NCFS Unbound. And hopefully we'll see you all at a future webinar. So thank you for being here.